Nutrition is one thing that impacts every stage of our birds' lives. But do you get confused by all the different types of feed and the feed analyses? Well, in this episode of the Poultry Keepers podcast, Jeff Maddox will help you penetrate the curtain of confusion on poultry nutrition. Folks, Jeff Maddox has a real gift for being able to take a complicated subject and simplify it so that it's easy for you to understand and apply.
That's right, John. Jeff is hands down the best poultry nutritionist I have ever met. Not only that, he's also willing to work with small breeders like you and I, and that's a rare thing today. You know, Jeff and I originally recorded this presentation you're about to hear 2 years ago, but it's just as relevant today as it was back then. So let's get rolling. Now, here's Jeff.
I've been working poultry nutrition now for 26 years. I am unlike other poultry nutritionists who work for the large integrators. I actually work for the small farmers. So whether it's people with 3 chickens in their backyard or up to 10 or 15,000 chickens, but they're pretty much raising them outside, open air, moving them around in fields, more of a natural way of doing things. And I do a lot with the organic folks who prefer to, keep their birds in an organic fashion. So coming at it from that standpoint, I've always felt that if I overfeed the birds or give them more than what the bare minimum requirements are, that I can keep them healthier and they function better and they reproduce better and they're just all the way around more fun to have. Everybody knows when your birds are healthy, they're a lot of fun. When they're not, you're pulling your hair out trying to get it under control. It's a pain. I'd rather pay for it ahead of time and try and keep them as healthy as possible than try and work from behind. And I watch a lot of folks out there and they go to whether it's Tractor Supply or wherever their garden center or their farm center is, and they're checking prices, right? They're not checking the contents of the bag. They're not checking the nutritional levels. They're not looking at the ingredients in there, right? They're looking for $16.95. If they see one for 22 and one for 16, you know which one they're going to buy. Eventually that comes around and bites you. I encourage everybody to read the tags, look at the nutrient levels, understand what you're reading. If you need help with that, reach out to me, take pictures of the tags, email them to me, right? I'll tell you which one is full of garbage and which one is going to be the healthier choice for your chickens. And do this for a lot of folks, okay? So it's not a problem. I'd rather see people have good, healthy chickens than, the worst thing I do is open up Facebook and I go to a couple of different poultry groups and people are talking about this sick chicken and that sick chicken. It's just no fun at all. It takes the fun out of raising chickens when you go out to a group of sick birds. But, you asked me to talk about nutrition a little bit, going up through the different phases and kind of what to look for or what I'm formulating for. First off, try and avoid byproducts. Okay. Byproducts are put in feeds to make them cheaper, but people don't understand they have no nutritional value. They're not adding anything to that feed for the bird. All they're doing is diluting it down to get the price point down. A lot of the folks that I'm working with currently are actually seeing that when they feed a higher nutritional value without byproduct, higher nutritional value feed without byproducts, they're feeding 20 to 25% less per day and getting better results. Okay. So the first number one failure that I see, and this isn't just in the poultry world, it's everywhere, is some people make this assumption that all feeds are created equal. So if it says 16% layer, it's the same as the 16% layer beside it and the one beside that and the one beside that. And they're not. So learning how to read between the lines on the ingredients is really important. Look for as many whole grain. When I say whole grains were used to process the feed, whether you're using a pellet or a mash. Look for as many whole grains. When you see the word byproducts, that should be a red flag to you. That means that they're diluting it down. And now over the years working with folks like you, Rip, and other breeders, I've been working with breeders more intently over the last 10 years. Breeding birds and show fowl And, the high-end exotic fowls, their nutritional requirements can't be purchased over the counter at a local feed store. Nobody's making a feed for a truly good feed for show fowl or breeding. As I've dug into it and I've worked with breeders over the past years, the nutritional values, particularly in the vitamins and the amino acids, need to be about 20% higher than a regular backyard chicken. Okay. Just, the basic laying hen that somebody's going to have in their backyard, they're going to do fine with Tractor Supply or whoever's, 16, 17, 18% layer feed. But it's not going to put the plumage on, and it's not going to give the attributes, those distinct attributes to a breeding type chicken. It's just not, they're not going to reach their full genetic potential. So when I say that, it's like, if you're picking a chick starter, instead of picking an 18% chick starter, you should be looking for probably a 22 to 24% game bird starter. Again, looking at those ingredients that are in there and looking at the levels. For instance, you should be looking for almost a 6,000 vitamin A units, international units of vitamin A per pound of feed. All right. Most chick starters out there are only running at 3,000. So it's about half of where it needs to be. The fowl that we're talking about today develop slower than the commercial birds. They're not made to be, finished in 8 weeks. They're not, they're just a different breed. Their feed intake is actually a lot less than a lot of the commercial or domestic fowl out there. So we have to get more per bite than, for our type of chicken or our type of fowl, we have to get more per bite than what most feeds are offering out there. So pretty much all the way through each one of the feeds, we want to run at between 5,000 and 6,000 international units of vitamin A. I'd like to have 1,500, actually 2,000 international units of vitamin D. These are things you can look at on the tag. These are required by law to be on a tag. If you see a chicken feed tag that doesn't have these on it, it's not legally labeled. And you probably need to keep looking. So if they can't even follow the basic guidelines for labeling requirements, chances are that there's something else missing. Vitamin E, it's going to be really hard to find, but I like to have 50 international units per pound. Calcium levels should, for young and developing birds, whether it's starter grower or developer, you want about a 1.25 on your calcium level. So your minimum would be 1, your maximum would be 1.5. Phosphorus is a big corner that a lot of feed companies cut because phosphorus is not cheap. And I like to see a phosphorus level running around 0.75 to point. It's going to give you better bone formation. Working with breeders, I hear about crooked keels and I hear about different things like that. And a lot of that's coming to not enough or the wrong kind of minerals being used. Some of that can be avoided by hitting the right mineral contents. Then you roll into your amino acids. Some are going to they have to guarantee methionine and lysine. Lysine on a show or breeder fowl should be at 1.1, and the methionine level should be 0.45 or higher. Actually, I like 0.5. Now, they're going to give you minimum guarantees, which means that's not their actual amount. They rounded them down to make sure that they hit their requirements. So chances are they're going to be about not a half a percentage point, but they're going to be about 10% higher than what's actually on the label, just to give them some protection. Each state is required to do a feed inspection. So twice a year, they go to feed manufacturers, feed stores, any places that feeds are being sold, and they'll take samples. Sooner or later, you're going to see this little white sticker on the side of the bag you bought that says sampled by the state of Florida in your case, or whatever state you're in. That's going to happen. And, the states have a little bit of a quality control guarantee built in for testing to make sure that things are being done right. And that's a good thing. So starter feed, depending on how it's put together and hitting those amino acids I just talked about, for sure want a 22, 23, 24. Now, the variation on that protein is how heavily plumaged is the bird. So if you have more of the exotics with a lot of plumage on them, right, or you need better feather, look at the methionine level, because that's going to be your key driver for, how that feather turns out. But also total protein is going to make a difference. Now, don't go crazy. When I say total protein, that doesn't mean I want you to run out and buy some 28% game bird starter, because too much protein is just as bad as not enough. The kidneys of the bird has to process all excess protein through the kidneys. If you continue to burn them up by putting too much, exceeding their protein requirement for an extended period of time, you're actually causing kidney damage in the long term, which is going to shorten the lifespan of the bird. Rip, you look like you have a question.
No, I just one thing I'd like to point out here. I've got several friends who raise phoenix and have these ultra long tails on the males. And I can see where information would certainly benefit them, because those feathers are in a state of constant growth. They never really mature. I've got some friends and they all have 4 or 5 foot tails on their males easily. But I just, in my own mind, I wonder how much more impressive would those birds look if they were on this kind of a diet, one with really good super nutrition. Just some food for thought.
Yeah, it is. And so unfortunately, breeders and show folks out there, again, they can't find that perfect feed. And even if they did, a lot of them would reject it based on price. But those phoenix, once they get past about 28, 30 weeks of age, most of their body is fairly filled out. Okay. So keeping them on this really high protein level feed is not necessarily the right answer. It's getting the feed with elevated levels of amino acids. So it's developing a feed for the phoenix, and it can be an 18% feed, but I might have my methionine levels at 0.6. Now, having extra methionine and extra lysine and extra amino acids doesn't hurt the kidneys. Okay. It at that point, it's not going through the body as a protein, and it's easier for the body to utilize as an amino acid. So, and even the large commercial, the Purdue's, the Pilgrim Prides, et cetera, the Tysons of the world, they're reducing protein levels in their chicken feeds, and they're putting in amino acids to get the desired results. We just kind of have to catch up to this technology with show birds.
Interesting.
Okay. They're knocking 2 points off their protein because soybeans cost money. So by manipulating the amino acids more precisely, they're able to achieve the same results and save money in the end. And the same could be said for, breeding and show fowl. If we could find feed manufacturers to work with us, but we're scattered out all over the place. Nobody wants to pay shipping. I could go to a feed mill here in Pennsylvania and say, hey, can you make this show fowl feed for me? Yes, sir. Make it for you. But then till I ship it to Florida and I add $4 or $5 a bag for shipping, you get it down there. And if I came to you and Rip said, hey, I have the perfect show feed. If you didn't know me from Adam and I said, it's going to cost you $32 a bag, you're going to be like, what? I can go down the street and buy, $20 feed, right?
I've heard that a lot too.
Yeah, right. And I hear it all the time, right? It's like, there can't be that much difference between your feed and what I can buy down the street for $10 a bag less. Well, yeah, there actually can. And there's different levels of feed that you have to be considerate of, right? So there's some birds in your flock that may never go for show. They may never go to the fairgrounds. They may never go to a poultry show. You're keeping them back for brood stock because they're good. You like them. They make a difference. And then, you've got that 20% that are going to go with you to show 20, 25%. Do they necessarily need to have the exact same feed? No, they probably don't. But then when I talk to a breeder and say, well, you can feed this group this and this group that. And they're like, I ain't going through all that. That's too much fuss and trouble, and I'm not going to do it. And, and I'm going to feed them all one feed. And of course, they feed the cheaper feed because, and everybody keeps way too many birds, right? They like this hen and they like this cock, and, they have a hard time culling, and they have a hard time, selling off birds. They get attached to them, whether it's emotional or financial or whatever. And they just can't, they can't trim down the herd, so to speak. But,
Excuse me.
For pretty much I work with all livestock, and kind of a basic rule of thumb is to cull out 10 to 20% annually at your most expensive time of year to feed them, right? You need to go through, look hard, make the hard judgment calls, and whether you sell them or whatever you do, but culling them back down to a set number is very beneficial. And how you get people to do that is beyond me. I hopefully you've got some words of wisdom on how to do that, because I
really don't, because there seems to be two camps, and one group wants to cull their birds too soon, and the other camp doesn't really want to cull anything. It seems like I'll get folks contacting me, and I've got this 4-week-old chick. Which one should I keep? How do I know that they're not mature?
Yep, you can't tell at 4 weeks. From sitting around listening to circles, you can actually you can probably do an initial cull looking for defects at around 8 weeks. It's pretty hard to do it much before 8 weeks. Mm-hmm. Then you have a second selection somewhere between 12 and 16 weeks. Then pretty much after that, you're going to ride it out for close to a year to see how the bird fully develops, right?
Yes, but and some of those slow to mature breeds like Jersey Giants, you may be looking at 2 years before what you see is what you've actually got.
Right. But if you can knock that down by 50%, by the 6-month period, you should be able to see a lot of the defects, by 6 months of age. Not all. There's stuff that's going to develop late, just like you said, and I understand that. But, most people are carrying way too many birds.
I agree with you. I wish I could get people to understand what I call the rule of tens. For every 10 chicks you hatch, you're going to get one that's really decent enough to keep and move your program forward. Or for every 100, you're going to get 10.
Yep.
But and some folks just can't. Well, a friend of mine says if we all ate our, we'd be in a lot better shape.
Well, there's other people out there with backyard chickens that would love to have your. Right? Yes. You can still sell them to people in the neighborhood that aren't going to show and compete against you, right? Just put an ad on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace. It's not that hard. They're out there. And if you get your hatching around to the right time of year, 1st of April, everybody's looking for chicks for their backyard. So if you can get your timing right to get your hatches off and do that initial cull, by the 1st of April, you will have no problem selling them whatsoever. I just see people trying to keep way too many chickens, and then they complain about their feed bill. And I'm like, well, why do you have so many chickens? And I'm working with a lovely lady down in Texas right now. She had over 300 chickens in her yard. She wasn't focused on any one particular breed. She was just kind of all over the place because she loved chickens. And I'm like, all right, so you need to make this decision. Are you going to be a breeder? Or are you going to just have chickens? Because you can't do both. Okay.
Right.
You need to make the hard, conscious decision of, and I said, I'm fine with either one. You need to decide what works for you, but you can't keep a bunch of yard birds around for entertainment and try and be a serious breeder at the same time. There's too many risk involved. There's too many costs involved, and you just got to narrow it down and focus on something. So, and she is, and it was a rough night when she called a third of her birds and sent them all off to be sold. Yeah. But she sees the light at the end of the tunnel, and it'll get better. But
Jeff, if you would talk a little bit about the various stages our birds go through, from chicks to growers to to adults, and what should our folks be looking for, nutritionally speaking, and we'll just start with day-old chicks.
Yep. Day-old chicks, I started on that road, 23% protein. Make sure that those amino acids are where I talked about earlier on lysine, 0.5 on methionine. Try and look for the higher vitamin levels, right? The most you're going to find on the shelf is about 4,000 international units per pound. It's okay. That's a good starting point. We can look at adding supplements to that if we need to. Those numbers stay the same all the way through the rearing stage. So 4,000 at starter, 4,000 at grower, 4,000 at developer. And whether you're going to layer or whether you're going to a holding feed, it depends on your time of year. You don't want to feed a layer feed with high calcium year round. If your bird isn't producing an egg, feeding that extra calcium is not benefiting anybody. It's actually working against you. So working with breeders like you, Rip, what I do is, okay, so I ask you, what breed do you have and what is that maturing date? So if you say, okay, it's 28 weeks till my bird gets to basically sexual maturity or that point, they're not fully developed, but they're pretty much at what we would call mature. I divide that 28 weeks by 4 to tell me how long they need to be on starter, right? So for a 28-week bird maturing, 7 weeks on starter, 7 weeks on grower, 7 weeks on a developer. And then, then they're moving on, to whatever's next. So I break that up into, 3 equal segments. So you're going to be 9 weeks on each. That way I know that I'm hitting that nutritional need for that bird, at each one of those stages of developing. So you're starting out with 22, 23 protein, then you're going to drop to, on a show, I would want to be no less than 18 to 20 on a grower feed. Developer feed is going to be 16 to 18% protein without the high calcium. Okay. And that's, again, focus on better amino acid levels. That's where your feather is coming from. That's where your body development's coming from. Hopefully, if your feeds are being made somewhat local to you, they're being balanced for the right carbohydrates based on your temperature and your climate. That would be really nice. But your starter feed should be, well, it's not on the tag. So how do I tell somebody you need 1,300 kilocalories per pound, right? I don't know how to explain the energy part of it. Because if a lot of feeds have a bunch of added fats added to them, they have higher energies. And all that's going to do is start the formation of fat deposits, okay, at a very young age. And I don't really want I don't want fat starting to even begin to be deposited until the bird is about 2/3 through that development phase. You don't want any early age fat. So, you want a good exercise area so they can run some of that off. And you in Florida, I would want a lower energy. I would trim that energy because chicken, people don't understand. A chicken actually eats for its energy needs every day. So based on the temperature, the living environment, and everything else, it's going to eat the number of calories it needs to sustain itself on a given day. So on hotter days, they eat less. On colder days, they eat more. And that's just the nature of a chicken. A lot of creatures are actually that way. All right, so we got the starter, we got the grower, we got the developer, and then you got to decide so for a show fowl, pretty much going to be 17 plus 18% is pretty much going to be the maintenance level protein. Again, I want at least a 1% lysine. 1.2 is better. I want at least a 0.5, 0.47, 0.5 on methionine to keep the plumage where it needs to be. Now, each one of these diets, I've found that if I keep my fiber level at around 5%, give or take 1, and my fat level at 5%, 4 to 5%, that seems to be the best health number for keeping the birds good and healthy, looking good, not getting fat. So fat and fiber should pretty much always be equal. So if your fiber goes up, your fat can go up as well. But 5% fat, 5% fiber, really good numbers, really good baseline numbers. Up here in the north, in the wintertime, I could go to 6 or 6.5% fat to help compensate for cold weather.
Mm-hmm.
But even in the south, where you are, I wouldn't want to go below 5. So people don't understand cholesterol, liver function in a chicken has a lot of similarities to you and I. So we need a certain amount of fat in our diet, right? Just for our liver to function correctly, cholesterol to be deposited, it goes into the liver, gets broke apart, goes out and does a whole lot of functions in the body. And 5% seems to be the right number for poultry. That is, I have some poultry diets as high as 10%. Now that's getting really high. I don't recommend that to anybody, but on specialty cases or certain purposes, you can go as high. But if you keep it between 4 and 6, 5 being the target number, it's really good. And we're actually starting to learn more here in the U.S. about dietary fiber being important to a chicken. We've overlooked it for years. I mean, if I go walk down the aisle at the feed store, you're going to see a bunch of 3.5, fibers. And a lot of that fiber is actually coming from very soft fibers like wheat middlings that don't have any structural density to them. Whereas feeding something like an alfalfa meal, alfalfa hay, oats, barley, those all have a higher density fiber, and it stays intact going through the gut wall and the intestinal tract, and actually is scouring and cleaning that on a continuous basis. So I get more nutrient absorption through that intestinal wall than I do on a low fiber diet.
Mm-hmm. What about things, and I know people are prone to feed things like scratch feeds or sunflower seeds. I've heard this before, but
yeah, scratch grain really has no nutritional value to it other than carbohydrates. So scratch grain is going to lead to a fatter chicken. The scratch grain is like me having ice cream after dinner every night. A little bit, not a problem. Okay. If I sit there and I eat the whole thing, or that's all I eat, that's going to become a big problem. And the scratch grains and the sunflower seeds are pretty much in the same vein as me eating ice cream. It's a feel good thing for the owner, right? My chickens love me when I show up with scratch grains. Well, you show up at my house with 5 gallons of ice cream, I'm going to love you too. And but it doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? Figure out a different treat for your chickens besides, feeding them ice cream and stuff that doesn't really add to their nutritional health. Sunflower seeds, huh?
I was just going to say one thing that I found a long time ago was I can take some of my regular feed that I'm feeding them and moisten it. I don't want it soupy wet or anything like that, but just enough to where it can stick together and roll it into little balls. Yep. And just toss some of those balls and moisten the feed out there, and they go nuts for it.
Yep. Just as like it with scratch grain. I mean, they like moistened feed. So you want to make a treat? There you go. That's a perfect idea. Just like a real dry cookie dough kind of consistency, enough to make a ball out of it.
Just get it whole together.
Yeah, you're delivering them the same thing. You're just delivering it in a different form, and and they think it's special. And I mean, if you want to trick them a little bit, you can put a teaspoon of molasses per quart of water before you do the moistening, and it'll change the aroma of it a little bit, and they'll get even a little bit more crazy about it. But you know what? A teaspoon in a quart of water is going to do almost 15 pounds of feed or more, right? So you're not throwing off that nutrition hardly at all.
Right.
Yeah. I got some other guys that are doing that and then freeze it and put it out there on the really hot, miserable days.
Yeah.
And just let them peck at some frozen food. And again, they love it. So
good deal.
Sunflower seeds. Go ahead.
What about over-the-counter feed supplements? What are your thoughts on those? I know there's a lot of them out there, and I've never really found but one that I thought was worth investing in.
A lot of that stuff is salt-based. If you read really close, like the water soluble vitamin
Mhm.
electrolytes,
Mhm.
and a lot of that stuff, it has a lot of salt in it. And that's where the electrolyte parts come and kind of kicking in. They're potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, sodium chloride. You got to be careful. Chickens have a really low threshold for salt, and it's just not. Again, and we're going to start doing, if we do them all the time, every day, we're going to start, causing some kidney damage, or we're going to put extra stress on the kidneys. Let's put it that way. Did we do damage or not? Hard to tell. You know what? If people want to make their own chicken Gatorade, the recipe is really easy. Okay. It's 2 ounces of apple cider vinegar, 1 tablespoon of molasses, put a teaspoon of salt in that. This is per gallon. Mix it up really well. If you think it needs color, put a little bit of food coloring in it. But otherwise, that mixture of vinegar, molasses, and a little bit of salt is going to do way more than a bag of electrolyte that you're buying at the store. Okay. And when you compare the cost of what I just described, what do you got? 25 cents worth of ingredients to make a gallon of chicken Gatorade. And the chickens are going to thrive on it, especially when it's really hot. When, like right now, this is a perfect time of year to be making a little chicken Gatorade, serve it, 2-3 times a week, something like that. And they're going to be, but I purposely stay out of the farm stores and I don't walk down that chicken aisle to look at those supplements that you're referring to, Rip. I just don't do it because I either get all riled up about the garbage they're serving people, or I say something and then I piss off one of my friends or something like that because they like it, and I explain to them why they're getting ripped off. But so if you can't say something nice, don't say anything. And if I stay out of those aisles, I don't have to worry about saying something bad.
What about feed supplements? And I'm going to preface this by saying that Jeff has a feed supplement on the market that is the only one I've ever felt like was A, worth the money, or B, I wanted my birds to eat. But what are your thoughts on that?
So what I did is I averaged out like a bunch of ready to layer feeds or commercially available feeds, knowing what the difference is between that and what a breeder or a showbird needed. So I put it in and I started adding the vitamin A, the vitamin D, the vitamin E, the lysine, the methionine, and a different kind of protein. And that's how that supplement came about. The breeder supplement, that's how it originated. And, at 1 teaspoon per bird now 1 teaspoon per adult bird per day, it works out to about 3 cents per chicken per day. Okay. It's 2.6 grams. I took it home and weighed it on a gram scale. So it ends up being about 2.6, 2.7 grams per bird per day. It's a pain to deal with, but it's making up the difference between everyday chicken nutrition and breeder and show fowl nutrition. That it's closing that gap. So you can continue to feed, what you can find locally. And this allows us to supplement it, and try and keep the cost down. That's how that all got started. That's really what I sat down one day and said, man, these folks need help. And that's what I put together. Of course, Kenny and Frank, they tried it out and a few other people, and everybody liked it. So we just rolled it out and started talking to people about it.
And that's available in both a powdered form and a pellet form?
Yep. We offer it in both powder and pellet. It comes in 10-pound and 40-pound bags. When they call in or they contact us, we have a shipping price regardless of where you're at. And in all 50 states, we can ship it.
Thanks, Jeff, for sharing your knowledge. Jeff will be sharing more information with us in future episodes of the Poultry Keepers podcast. So be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss a thing. If you're interested in the Poultry Show and Breeder Supplement Powder, a 10-pound bag is $49 and can be ordered directly from the Fertrell Company, and that does include shipping. If you want to learn more about poultry nutrition, you need to get yourself a copy of Jeff's latest book, Niche Poultry Feeding and Management. It features an expanded information on feeding heritage and show poultry. And I guarantee it's a book you'll refer to often, and that can also be ordered from Fertrell.
You're going to find links to the products we just talked about, as well as email addresses for our show and Jeff's email if you want to shoot him a question about poultry nutrition. That's one thing I love about Jeff. He's always there to help us. John, I think this about covers it. But before we go, I want to thank the listeners for joining us for another episode on the Poultry Keepers podcast. Folks, until next time, keep learning and enjoying your birds, and make sure to keep them scratching
and pecking. So long.